Before I get started, I want to give a quick warning that this review contains spoilers for Part 2 of Disenchantment. This is the kind of season where it's hard to talk about the pros and cons without getting into the specifics. A lot of weird crap goes down in this season. So spoilers ahead, you have been warned. So Disenchantment Part 2. I'm going to be upfront right here. I don't think Part 2 is going to win over many people not convinced by Part 1. I hate to say it, I'm rooting for this series, but I think that's just where it is currently. The good news is that this run of episodes improves upon the first set and presents many intriguing ideas. This is a stronger set of episodes as a whole. Unfortunately, it can be a pretty frustrating series sometimes, in that you can see that glimmer of greatness shining in there, but there are just odd choices that weigh the whole thing down. Like, let's start out by talking about the editing and the pacing of the individual scenes. Editing-wise, Part 2 feels much snappier than Part 1. I had talked about in the past how there were many scenes that would last a few seconds too long, or there would be dead space or transitions that mess up the action. Most of those issues are pretty much gone in Part 2. It could be that I'm just getting more used to the cadence of the series by now, but, by and large, they are better at making their scenes flow together now. As a result, the comedic timing of the jokes has improved. This is still not exactly a laugh factory like Matt Groening's other shows, but the jokes they do tell tend to land better than in Part 1. They're making good progress. The downside is that the series doesn't have a strong grasp at how to sell its most dramatic moments with the audience. It's almost a little too quick, a little too casual when things get real. For example, the first episode centers around Bean hanging around Maru, with Queen Dagmar basically gaslighting her about not being evil. About 2/3 of the way in, Bean finally puts it together and realizes the truth. But Disenchantment totally no-sells this moment. It's not some big dramatic moment of revelation. It's just, wait, you did it. And Queen Dagmar's like, geez, you finally figured it out. Now I'm gonna lock you in this room. We get to know Jerry in this episode and become fond of him, and then when Dagmar kills him in the climax, it happens really quickly, like she's squashing a bug. I know Jerry isn't a major character, but you gotta sell the emotion of this moment more. Why make the audience like him so much if you're going to no-sell his death? It even affects character arcs. Elfo goes to hell and is tortured by having to repeatedly relive his worst nightmare. This is a moment that drives most of the conflict between them in this season. What we get is about 3 or 4 seconds of Elfo watching sadly before we cut away to King Zog. I'm not saying to put an entire sappy montage of Elfo's soul being destroyed, we just need the weight of the situation conveyed better. Some of this might be the soundtrack, to be honest. Mark Mothersbaugh is cool and all, I like him, but I've never felt like the score of Disenchantment underlines its scenes particularly well. Music is one of the most efficient methods at juicing a scene. Maybe tweaking the score would make these big moments hit a little harder. The best thing about Disenchantment right now is its sense of exploration and adventure. Just the sheer concept of wandering around and looking at weird crap. The first episode is practically a point-and-click adventure game. There's so much exploration. Like we're playing King's Quest or something, and Bean is going from room to room, interacting with mysterious objects, and solving inventory puzzles. There are later episodes, like visiting Steamland, going on a quest for legendaries, or exploring an underwater cave, where it feels very atmospheric, very mysterious and wonderful. I think compared to The Simpsons and Futurama, this is the coolest thing that Disenchantment does. This is why I watch this show instead. When Disenchantment is doing all this exploration and adventure stuff, I'm interested, especially since these sequences showcase the beautiful animation and set pieces. Just gorgeous. The shadow work in particular is amazing. Disenchantment is a series with a lot to discover, but in terms of its secrets, they're playing things really close to the vest. Sometimes frustratingly so. They're excellent at setting up mysteries, inserting lots of plot elements that draw interest, like, what's up with that crown? What are the elves after in Dreamland? What is Steamland after? All of these questions are explicitly asked to the audience. But the series also loves to put in strange moments that could be a thing, could not be a thing, just leaving it sorta open-ended. Like, who actually did kill Elfo in Part 1, and why? Why did they show Bean get scratched by that old lady? Did Bean's family put something in her drink? Why is Bean and King Zog having this odd discussion about the power of dreams? I feel drawn in by these hints because it feels like the writers are up to something and I want to find out what it is. All this stuff works. Where Disenchantment stumbles is when it starts asking questions and then forgetting about them almost immediately. In episode 4, Bean discovers a cave beneath the castle and gets freaked out by something living in the dark. But in episode 5, she completely forgets about it. There's no scene where she's like, "Hey Dad, there's something down there." Maybe they go down there together and find nothing. Same with the storyline about Elfo's parentage. They ask the question in part 1, but then we have to leave Elfwood and can't get an answer. And Elfo dies, which is also kind of an obstacle. Either way, the wait is understandable. But then in part 2, when they're hanging out with his dad and even broaching the subject again, there isn't really a reason to be coy about it, especially since they're dropping so many hints about Elfo potentially being half ogre. These frustrations aside, I like that part 2 is willing to change up the formula and put characters in new situations. The show never does feel static. They take a character like Queen Una and explore what she actually wants out of life. The elves reboot themselves into a new setting. King Zog takes a bullet. Prince Derek becomes King of Dreamland. They've done a good job establishing and building up the secondary characters overall. The executioner guy can swoop in and save the day, and we totally get it. King Zog continues his relatively sedentary role in part 2. He just kind of bums around the castle, gets involved in a love story, has a wacky B-plot, stuff like that. At the beginning, he gets left behind in Dreamland and doesn't have much to do, just hanging out with stone statues and Prince Merkimer. I mean, I guess I won't complain, since Merkimer is the most consistently funny character on the show. Zog stuff just feels a bit like padding sometimes. At this point, he's really at a crossroads as a character, and I'm interested to see where they're going to take him. They established how he was a warrior prince and never really wanted to be king. We got to see his battle prowess. I honestly wouldn't mind seeing him in a new role for the future. I would be down for a season of King Derek bungling his way into competence. Bean is written as being much more conscientious and moralistic in the series of episodes. She still drinks and parties and stuff, she's just a bit less murdery this time around. The general shift makes a lot of sense, given the kinds of problems she faces, I suppose. We're starting to see a transition from the rebellious princess trope to someone more level-headed and pragmatic. Maybe she's rebelling against her mother now, huh? She's like an odd combination of Homer and Lisa Simpson, where she parties and has fun and will be irresponsible, but is good at calling stuff out and investigating mysteries. I really like where Bean is as a character right now. They're hitting that balance just right. Lucy keeps on trucking along with this whole lovable rogue thing. He continues getting the witty one-liners, lots of banter with Elfo. That stuff still works. I'm worried that this character is getting a bit too formulaic and predictable, though. They'll do stuff like, "Oh no, Lucy is betraying Bean, so dramatic." But we've all seen this jerk with a heart of gold archetype before. The betrayal will never ever be convincing. It's not that interesting these days to observe, well actually Lucy is the most fiercely loyal character, isn't that ironic? I think there's room to play around with this fallen demon concept. Lucy, much like Elfo, is kinda stuck between two worlds. I think there are more opportunities to show off Lucy's discomfort with that status. Now, for Elfo, well, I hate to say it, he was my favorite character in part 1, but the writers really need to put some work into him. So far, he's arguably the most sympathetic character on the show, considering all the bad stuff that's happened to him. The guy is killed, and then tortured in hell, all so he can come back to a world where he doesn't quite fit in with anyone. Yet somehow, I have trouble connecting with Elfo as a character. He has a sympathetic story, but he's not written that sympathetically. They instead lean on how annoying he can be, how in some situations he's ridiculously naive, yet in others, he's basically dead inside. We never quite know if we're going to get good Elfo or bad Elfo. I said in my part 1 review that Elfo strikes me as a very difficult character to write for, and I'll double down on it here. We've seen these super naive and bubbly fish out of water types before, There's definitely a bit of Philip J. Fry in Elfo's characterization. But what happens when the super naive character literally goes through hell? How do you portray that change in the character, that bitterness that would naturally develop? Do we even want a more bitter version of that archetype? It sounds like I'm saying that the writers should pick a lane with Elfo, but mostly I think they need to make him more relatable. They give a character like Prince Derek this moment, where he wistfully stares out at the water, missing his mother. It's super cliche, but it works. I feel bad for Derek. Elfo could use more moments like these that are not undercut by jokes, where we can walk in Elfo's shoes for just a little bit, really understand why he's so misunderstood. I don't want to listen to him complain about his problems, I want to know who Elfo is. I feel that way sometimes about Disenchantment as a whole. Much like Elfo, this feels like a series that's getting pulled in two radically different directions. One, this epic fantasy with a serialized plot that might appeal to the Game of Thrones crowd, at least a more TV-14 version of that. But also a subversive and quick-witted episodic comedy in the vein of Futurama. They're currently landing somewhere in the middle, which I think is causing both crowds to not feel completely satisfied. Why isn't there a joke every second? Where is my melodrama? I actually do enjoy this sort of hybrid approach, to be honest. I know I've been critical of its execution in this video, but it's mostly because I think there's a lot of potential here. We've done Futurama and The Simpsons. I don't want to see another series in those exact formulas. Disenchantment tells self-contained stories sometimes, but literally every single one of them sneaks in some little element, some little Easter egg that's gonna pay off later. Sometimes they sneak in two of these. In a lot of ways, Disenchantment is structured more like a Gravity Falls kind of show, rather than a Futurama. They should definitely do fun adventures of the week still, they just can't abandon whatever plot thread they're pulling on. The Netflix audience is watching all these in order. So yeah, I'm still really enjoying Disenchantment, even if I do nitpick it quite a lot. I think there's something really interesting hidden in all that darkness. I just think we've reached the point where we need to see what it is. Bring on part 3.